Hi, this is BLUEBOX from 1010Music, and as small as it seems, it's a 12-track input, 6-track output digital mixer. It's designed for synths, Eurorack modules, and other electronic music instruments. The main idea behind it is simple: to save space on the desktop compared to guys like these by not providing mic preamps or high-Z inputs, and to further shrink things down by replacing the knobs and faders you typically get with mixers with a touchscreen. It also has a multi-track recorder, which we're also increasingly seeing on desktop mixers. This one also has multiple takes per track. We'll explore that as well. Before I start, full disclosure, BLUEBOX was sent over by 1010Music at no cost to me, but as usual, they have no say over the content of this video. Reviews here are never paid. This channel is funded by the good people on Patreon, the ad you just skipped, and an occasional affiliate link in the description. Another thing, this is a pre-production unit. I'm told the only difference between this and the production units will be that the labels up here will be A and B instead of info and back. Let's start with an overview of how BLUEBOX connects to the outside worlds. You can see only 9 jacks here as opposed to 12 and 6. The way it connects to the outside world is using TRS style cables. This means that you can use the inputs and the outputs either for 6 stereo inputs and 3 stereo outputs, or if you have a tip ring cable like this, an insert or Y type cable, then you can use these to get 12 inputs into here and potentially 6 outputs. Also on the back are a USB Type B device jack, currently only for power, and a USB Type A jack, host jack, currently available to power other devices. I found that I could power, say, the TR6S with it, but I did get a buzz when I did, kind of like that computer ground noise, so I just ended up powering the 6S with a wall wart instead. Now, I say currently about this because 1010Music have indicated that they will support external MIDI controllers through the Type A jack. They haven't said anything about this being an audio interface, but potentially I guess that could be done in the future, though again, no current plans for that. And that is an important thing to keep in mind. Currently, BLUEBOX can't be used as an audio interface for your computer, though of course you can route your computer audio into here and then send that out to your speakers. It just means that you can't multitrack into a DAW, you can just multitrack onto the SD card. To round out the connectivity picture, BLUEBOX also has 3.5mm MIDI in and out ports on the front, and it also has an SD card slot, a micro SD card slot. Multi-track recordings are streamed to the SD card, and you can also save projects on them, meaning the machine status, sends, levels, and so on. Let's take a look at the overall workflow for BLUEBOX. Front and center is a touchscreen, which you can do a lot of things with. It's clearly viewable from any angle, and it's in color, and it's very responsive, so no missed taps on this one. You've got 8 pads on the bottom that let you select the different views or pages or modes that are available. The transport buttons initiate either playback of what you recorded or multi-track recording. And on top are 2 buttons. Like I said, they'll be labeled A and B. Typically A, or info in this case, gives you an expanded view of something. So this is the EQ. If you click here, you'll get an expanded view of the EQ. And then on the left, the B button will typically give you more information about something. For example, these are a few send and compressor settings. Or on the effects page, A will drill down and give you access to XY pads for the delay and reverb, and B will let you access the reverb parameters. On most screens, the knobs will give you access to 4 parameters that are usually aligned with the way that the knobs are arranged. So for example, if I want to edit the delay parameters, I've got timing, cutoff, feedback, and width, then the 4 knobs control those parameters. Same goes, for example, here, I'm controlling volume, pan, and gain with the top 2 knobs and the left knob. In this case, this doesn't impact recording, so it'll impact the pan control. And if I tap on the right, then the 4 knobs control the 4 sends for the different tracks. It's not always like this, but you can sort of figure things out. So on this screen, for example, these 2 control the master level, and then this controls the Q and the out 2 levels. One final thing about the controls, you can control parameters using the knob, but you can also just grab a parameter on the touchscreen and drag it up and down any way you want. It's a nice relative motion, so wherever you press, it'll start moving from there and go up or down based on how you move your finger, regardless if you move it sideways. And even though they're quite small, this also works for these little dials. This is probably as good a time as any to mention that BLUEBOX can create 3 separate mixes for each of the 3 outputs, 3 stereo mixes for the main out, the output 2, and the Q or headphone output. Moving on, BLUEBOX has two main view modes, single row mode and dual row mode. You change that currently over here, and it's called vertical mode on or off, but I think they're going to change the way that it's called. Anyway, vertical off is 2-row mode and vertical on is single row mode. You've been watching single row mode up until now, so you see every single track gets its own dedicated column, and that's fine I think when you've got 6 stereo tracks. But if you want to move into a mode where you're looking at monophonic tracks and 10 or 12 separate tracks, then it can get pretty crowded, which is when you'd want to go to dual row mode or vertical off in this case, and then that looks like this, which gives you a 2-row view to your tracks. This mode also has the benefit of having the knobs very intuitively mapped to levels, top 2 and bottom 2, and you can control the different groups like this. But personally, since so far I've been working with 6-track mode, then I find this a little confusing. I just prefer to go back to single row mode. The next thing you should know about BLUEBOX is that you have the freedom to both name your tracks, but also assign if they listen to either a stereo input or to a single mono input. So let's take a look at this project. For example, I've got my Mac, my computer, coming in through input 1, listening both to the left and right channels. I've got track 2 listening to the TR6S, also in stereo, which makes sense, obviously. Then I've got track 3 listening to Brenso over here, only on the left input. I could have used a splitter like this and then used a different track to listen to the right input, and that's how you get to more than 6 tracks. Track 4 is my kick, again in mono, triggered by sample drum and either this or a clock. We'll get to that later. Track 5 is Microcosm, also listening in stereo. I'm using Microcosm as an external send effect. We'll get to that later on, but it's a nice way to leverage external effects here. So it's doing that timed to this. And then I'm using track 6 for sidechain. We'll get to that, but it's listening in mono. So basically I've got 3 tracks to spare here that I could have added and used for other instruments in mono, or maybe an additional stereo instrument and one in mono. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper into the track parameters. You've got 2 views into the different parameters that you can control per track, the mixer view and the track view. The difference is that in the mixer view, you choose which parameter you want to edit, and then you apply that to the different tracks. So say if I wanted to arm tracks for recording, I could do it this way. And the disadvantage of this mode is that you need to toggle to see all the different parameters that you can control. It's 2 toggles, so 5 parameters per page. And then in track view, you see all the parameters on a per track basis. You can control them all at once, but you have to first choose the track that you want to control. So this is a great way to get a global view of, say, sends for a particular track, and this is a great way to mix a lot of things at once. Let's just go through the different parameters you can control very briefly. You've got volume or levels for each of the tracks, panning left and right. You can solo tracks or mute them. We saw arming for record previously. BLUEBOX won't record unless you arm the tracks. Gain is a preliminary trim for audio. You don't have control over the gain of the preamps, the physical amps that are built in this. They're just set and that's it. But this is a nice trim, so say if you're coming in from your rack, you'll probably have trim levels very low because things are very loud. If you're coming in at line level, you'll probably be somewhere around here. Once you've set your overall gain trim, then you can always go back and adjust volume. Anyway, back to page 2, you've got sends to FX1 and FX2. FX1 is a delay and FX2 is a reverb, the built-in delay and the built-in reverb. And then you've got send levels for the Q or phone's output and for output number 2. Let's just listen to the internal effects. FX1, like I mentioned, is the delay. And you control the effect parameters here. You've got timing. It can be either beat synced or not. And you have control over delay time and feedback. And cutoff and width, which is nice. Stereo width. And then the second internal effect is the reverb, the internal reverb. And yeah, that can get pretty big too. There are quite a few parameters to it. There's basic XY parameter control using this touchpad. effect. And then if you hit B or back, then you can control all the different reverb parameters. And yeah, it can do simple reverbs, but also some pretty creative stuff. And you can see the different parameters you've got control over here. A very interesting reverb. This is a kick, right? And it also has freeze, which you can also control through the main page. If you go into here, so you can activate freeze through here. Once you freeze a reverb, the subsequent audio won't be affected. But yeah, pretty nice feature. Anyway, so those are the internal sends. Beside those, you've got two additional sends, Q and out. They're identical. They're these two outputs. Now you can use these to just create simple mixes to bandmates, you know, say to a drummer. But since we don't have a drummer here, we'll use these as sends to external effects. So for example, here I'm using the Q output, the phone's output, sent out in stereo to Microcosm, which is a time-synced granular mangler that's hooked back in to return or to input number 5. I'm also using MIDI to sync the two because this is a time-synced effect. So let's take a listen to this. As I increase the send on the Q, you can hear Microcosm doing its thing. And the interesting thing is that you can determine whether the sends are pre-fader or post-fader. Now I've got it set to pre-fader, meaning that if I reduce the level of the success in the mix, it'll still send audio to Microcosm. So what you're hearing now is the mangling that Microcosm is doing without the success. I can increase that, of course. Which is pretty interesting because it's certainly not like this. If I went ahead into main, the parameters, and then set the Q mix to post-fader instead of pre-fader, and then go back into here. So this is with Microcosm's craziness. And if I were to reduce this level, then it would also reduce the levels being sent out to Microcosm. One more little tip, if you do use external effects, set the dry-wet level to all the way wet. You have the dry signal coming in directly. You don't need to mix it in the signal coming back from the pedal. Let's take a look at another mixer patch idea. As of the current version of the firmware of BLUEBOX, it doesn't have a per-track compressor, so it obviously doesn't have per-track sidechain, but you could use an external compressor, if that compressor had sidechain, and route any tracks to that compressor as a send, then receive them back in here. Now, it doesn't need to be a modular compressor, but since 1010Music said that BLUEBOX supports Eurorack levels, let's give it a shot. I'll unmute Brenso here, and it's being routed to the internal reverb. I also have a kick, which can survive without being routed to the reverb. Anyway, so we want this kick to duck anything that's being sent out the out to output. Now, the output to output is going into this VCA and then coming back into input 6. The percussion interface from 4MS is listening to this kick and then generating an inverse envelope, sort of like a ducking or sidechain effect, and sending that out to the VCA. Now remember what I said before about pre-fader and post-fader stuff. I actually don't want to hear neither Brenso or my computer through its main output. I just want to hear both of them through the sidechain sends. We only want Brenso and the Mac to send audio out to output 2, which is my sidechain send. And you can look at the main output, even though we're not hearing anything, the stuff is being sent out to output 2, and I can listen to it here. Anyway, when I hit the kick, and maybe let's just reduce the level of the kick so we can hear this. Right, so we're not hearing the kick now, but you can hear the ducking effect on Brenso. And yeah, we can make this rhythmic if we want. And add a pad to it. Again, without the kick. Anyway, a nice sidechain effect. Yeah, as a send and return both for a pad and for Brenso or any other audio you want to send to this sidechain ducking audio path. Okay, let's move on and talk about a few other things. You've got per track EQ. So for example, in the case of this kick, I actually applied quite a bit of EQ to it, as you can see here. So it wasn't always like this. This was the original kick. And it's a 4-node parametric EQ. I think they're planning to add a spectrum analyzer in here and change frequency to actual hertz instead of percentage. But overall, you've got control over frequency, the EQ type. There are a few low and high shelf and cuts, and as well as parametric EQ. So you can emphasize a frequency you like or cut out one that's annoying you. So EQ is always nice to shape your sounds, and there's also a master compressor, which by default is always on. We could go into main and then edit its parameters. You know, obviously we're not going to go over all the parameters, but compression is always nice to play with. And yeah, hopefully they add both a per track compressor, maybe even a simpler one, and sidechain. Time will tell. Compression is like an instrument. It's always useful to be able to play with its parameters in real time. So one last thing, let's take a look at recording. I'll start a new project for this. Let's just call it A. Anyway, a clean slate looks like this. I could set a project tempo or sync it over MIDI. I think this is at 144, so let's do that. And you can turn on a metronome, send it out any output you want, and control its level. You don't have to record with a metronome. You could just record straight into the timeline. In order to record a track, you need to arm it for recording. Let's arm both of these. And yeah, this won't be a masterpiece, but let's just hit record. So we have that. Currently you need to disarm tracks to play back audio, but I think that's going to change. And we can just play that back and hear what we recorded. Now, the nice thing about this is that you can have multiple takes in a project. So let's say that I didn't like what I played here. I could go ahead, record, arm just the Mac track. And we can now try out a completely different idea just for the pad track. So clearly the second idea isn't an improvement on the first one. Luckily, BLUEBOX saved both takes. You can see there are 2 takes here. So if I go into track 1, take 2 is active. I could go ahead into here and set take 1 to be active and go back to my old take. So pretty neat the fact that this supports multiple takes. It would be nice had there been a timeline here or some view of the waveforms. Some mixers also let you set loop points at bars, and this already counts bars, so it would be nice maybe to set a loop point and then multi-track a specific part of your track or repeat a few takes of that specific loop. Okay, let's talk about the pros and cons. On the cons side, let's separate hardware cons or negatives compared to firmware cons, because the hardware isn't likely to change, whereas the firmware might. Especially in comparison to other mixers, the inputs and outputs on BLUEBOX aren't balanced. Many electronic music instruments aren't either, but occasionally you'll get ground noise. I made a whole video about solving those problems. I'll link to it below. I did have ground issues here, and I fixed them using those tips. Aside from that, I'll start from the obvious. BLUEBOX has no mic preamps, high Z inputs, or phantom power, so if you want to record vocals or anything that requires those types of inputs, you'll need another piece of hardware to bridge that gap into these inputs. BLUEBOX also certainly isn't knob per function. While typical mixers are big and bulky, they do give you direct access to levels, tone controls, mutes, solos, and more, which obviously is a convenience. Finally, on the hardware side, the outputs and inputs are quite close, and there are 3.5mm jacks as well, so depending on the outputs on your gear, that may be either a pro or a con. I used a bunch of converters here, so a kind of big 1/4-inch converter to stereo small 3.5mm converter, and a bunch of these. They don't cost much on Amazon or AliExpress, but you will need them if you have gear that doesn't have just simple headphone outputs. Finally, on the hardware side, it would have been nice to have an on-off switch. The unit does tend to get a bit warm, not uncomfortably so, but to ease my guilt and conscience leaving this on overnight, it would be nice to have just a simple on-off switch rather than to have to unplug it every time. So those are the hardware cons, meaning things you can't change in firmware. Here's a few things I hope they add at some point, but have no indication that they're going to. Most importantly, I think BLUEBOX can't act as an audio interface, meaning you can't use it to multitrack audio directly into a DAW. You can, of course, copy the WAV files it makes and drag them onto your DAW's timeline. I'm just mentioning this in context of some other mixers that do allow for that. Second, there's no Bluetooth in here. Some mixers let you stream audio from your phone. Potentially, they could use the Type A jack here and a Bluetooth dongle to enable that, but again, no plans for that currently. This also doesn't support transferring files over the USB port. It would be nice to just have this work as an SD card reader so you don't need to unplug the card and plug it into a reader on your computer, or maybe even with a Wi-Fi dongle, move files back and forth over the air, one can hope. Another option I think would be nice here is the option to record at 44.1 kilohertz. Currently it records only at 48 kilohertz. 44.1 is a nice option that some mixers have. If the rest of your content is in that sample rate, things will blend more nicely together. Finally, I'm not expecting this to be a DAW, but the multi-track and multi-take features are really useful. It would be even better if you could start recording anywhere you wanted on the timeline and set loop points for multiple takes at a particular spot. So those are the cons I could think of. I'm sure you'll add yours in the comment section. On the pros side, it's really quite simple. If you're looking for the smallest possible mixer with the largest number of inputs and you're mainly oriented towards making electronic music with these kinds of things, BLUEBOX is one of the most interesting options out there. If you have this habit called buying and playing with hardware and Eurorack synths and drum machines, then desktop real estate is at a premium, and setting up your computer, a DAW, an audio interface, or a big mixer is a bit of a pain, and more importantly, something that can disrupt the flow of a good jam very easily. The ability to have something that's immediately accessible and small and can immediately record whatever you're doing, I think is something that's very useful in the heat of a jam. So that's it for BLUEBOX. I've recently added an entire chapter about mixing to my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks. It's available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Don't forget to ring the bell after subscribing if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching.